So thank you all so much for being here. It is a deep honor for both of us to be joining you all here. So my name is Michael Puett, and I work on classical Chinese religions. And a little bit closer. Is that good in the back? Can you hear me now? Okay, good. Please don't hesitate to make little motions if I let it fall too low or something. So I work on classical Chinese religions, and I'm very honored to be joined by Terry Kleeman, one of the world's specialists in the field of Taoism. And since, unfortunately, his book isn't downstairs, I want to take out an immediate moment to make a plug for it. Terry has written many, many books, but his most recent one is called The Celestial Masters, which is a full discussion of the field of Taoism. He is looking at the emergence of Taoism as a religion. He takes you through the rituals that people did on a daily basis, what life was like if you were a Taoist, and it's really, I think, by far, best book in the English language that really introduces what Taoism really is. So, since unfortunately it's not downstairs, please click it. It's called The Celestial Masters, and it is extraordinary. So, yes, indeed. So the way we'll be organizing today's conversation is I will begin with a few words about classical conceptions of yes, indeed. Thank you so much. So I'll begin with a few words about early Chinese notions of the self and the visions of religious practice that come out of that. I will then hand things over to Terry, who will turn to a discussion of Taoism, again, really one of the world's leading specialists. We will then turn to the current resurgence of religions in China, which is absolutely extraordinary. And then, of course, we will open it up for questions. So with that, we very much look forward to the discussion, and let me jump in. So to begin with, there's a story that is often told that Terry and I will be strongly disagreeing with in the hour to come, and that story goes something along the following lines. China never really had any religion. Basically, everyone in China were atheists. They just worried about ethical concerns of humans, and to whatever extent there were superstitious religious practices, as they're often called, those were ended in the 20th century anyway as China became a properly modern nation. Every single one of those statements is empirically wrong. And we will spend the next hour discussing what we as historians of Chinese religions have learned, both about the past and explaining what is going on right now as you're seeing this extraordinary resurgence of religious practices. And it's with that resurgence we're getting a better sense of what was going on in the past. It's also through our understanding of the past, with a tremendous number of documents we've been able to discover, that's allowing us to really see the current resurgence in a new way as well. So our goal in this hour will be to introduce you to what we are now learning about Chinese religions. So to give an introduction, let me just begin with one text from early China. One text because it introduces some terms that will be very helpful for the discussion to come. So there's a text from early China. It's discovered in a tomb. So we're getting tons and tons of text coming out of tombs. And I'll explain momentarily why they're in tombs and what else was in tombs at the time. But this is simply one text among many that explained how humans operate and therefore what we need to do. So here is the argument. The text, by the way, dates to about the 4th century BCE. So the argument is the following. The human body is composed of tons of energies. The Chinese term, of course, is qi. And we're all these just bundles of different energies. And what happens to humans when they begin interacting with each other is these bundles of energies interact with other bundles of energies. We sort of drag out from each other different energies. So someone yells at me, I get angry. That act of someone yelling at me drags out from me an energy of anger. Someone smiles at me, I feel happy. In this way of putting it, that act of someone smiling drags out from me an energy of happiness. Meaning that what we become as human beings in terms of just our relations with each other depends on the kinds of relationships we happen to fall into, dragging out these responses from each other. Some of them can be good, some of them, as I mentioned, the anger, can be very negative. Fine and good. Then, sadly, we all will at some point pass away. And when we pass away, new sets of relationships will be formed. Many initially can be quite negative, as sadly we've all experienced. So what will happen if, say, someone close to me passes away, that act, that moment, of course, will drag out for me energies of, needless to say, intense sadness, horrible feelings of loss. There are often, weirdly, these feelings of anger that can emerge too, sort of anger at someone for leaving me, even though it's obviously not their fault. But I mean, we've all experienced these very negative emotions. And so these very negative emotions can develop. And then imagine for the deceased, the same thing is going on. So they are deceased. They're this bundle of energies looking at us, going on with our lives over time without them. And it can draw out from them too the most negative emotions, intense anger, jealousy, resentment that the living are going on without them. So if we are these beings that kind of are defined by the relations we form with each other, the moment of death can be one of the most dangerous of these. It can unleash our worst sides. It can unleash the most dangerous sides of those who have passed away. The term in Chinese at the time was they can become a ghost, a dangerous ghost, a ghost that hates us. And because of this, what we are going to do as human beings is engage in practices to improve these relationships. So to begin with living humans, many of the ethical concerns of classical China will consist of ways in which we will engage in rituals to improve our relations with each other. So if we're constantly dragging out, at least at times, very negative emotions from each other, how do we use rituals to train our responses to each other so we can begin to relate better to each other? And then with the deceased, you do the same thing. You engage in rituals to try to alter that relationship, a relationship that, again, can become very dangerous. And for those, and I'll stick with the example that I began with, if someone close to me passing away, say it's someone very close to me, a parent, a grandparent, etc., one of the things I will try to do, therefore, is engage in rituals to reorient this potentially dangerous relationship as sort of a lost human alive and a very potentially angry ghost above, and you're trying with rituals to alter that relationship such that I become a good descendant, and he or she, you actually can have cults both ways, as we'll see momentarily, becomes an ancestor. And if this succeeds, what you are doing is you literally enter into a ritual space. I would make sacrificial offerings to the deceased. I would call the deceased to come down, and I would say things like, "You are now an ancestor. I am a descendant. Whatever," I wouldn't say what I'm about to say, but the sense would be, whatever problems we had when we were alive, and now perhaps much worse, now that the moment of death has occurred, we will now engage in rituals to reorient that, such that I will become a good descendant to you, you will become a good ancestor to me, you will hopefully support me, I will try to continue what you did, I will learn from this relationship and try to become a good parent for those to come, and just as you above fed me when I was growing up, I will try to do the same for the next generation, and you make this potentially very, very dangerous relationship into, over time, a lineage relationship of ancestors and descendants. Now again, I emphasize, you're making this be the case. In other words, it is the act of ritual, the ritual act, in this case a sacrificial offering, that is creating that relationship. Then what happens about everything else? Everything else meaning, first of all, sadly, some people will pass away and will not necessarily have immediate descendants who can make them into ancestors in this sacrificial cult. Also, there are lots of things out there. We're not quite sure what they are, but lots of powers out there. Many of them can seem kind of dangerous, so we'll give them the same name. We'll call them ghosts as well. We don't know their origin. They may have been deceased humans. They may not. We don't really know. There are also natural powers out there, right? There's the sun, there are rivers, powerful natural things. There, too, it's much the same thing. And so you develop ritual relationships with them to try to develop as much as possible that relationship into a productive one. So with the other things that we'll call ghosts out there, what we'll do is we will develop rituals that will try to make them into gods and goddesses, with ourselves as supporters of them. The acts are very similar. So again, we will call them into a ritual space. We will make offerings to them. We will give them a sacrificial name. And we will call on them to be supportive gods and goddesses. And we too will be supporters of them. We will feed them. We will engage in relationships with them. And the hope is that here again, you will move from a potentially fraught relationship. You will, again, alter that relationship through ritual to begin to create a productive one. Now, this is simply one text among many that will make a description of what is going on, but I want to use it to launch our discussion because I think it gives us a very powerful way of understanding a lot of these practices. And before turning things over to Terry, let me just give you an example of how this will play out in practice. I mentioned the ancestral cult, but the gods and goddesses will become a crucial part of the landscape of China. And to give you an example of what this looked like, let me jump about 2 millennia, well, not quite, but almost, about 1 millennium actually, and jump to about the 13th or 14th century to give you an example of what this actually would look like in practice, using a lot of the terms that we've introduced. So we're now something like the 14th century, and we're on the southeast coast of China. And a little girl goes out on a boat, and horribly, the boat capsizes and she drowns. And because she is drowned, she becomes a ghostly figure and starts dragging other sailors who go off into the ocean as well to join her. And because she has become one of these things that we've mentioned, she's become a ghostly presence, people begin trying to form a better relationship with her. So if you're going to go out on the ocean, what you'll do is you'll make offerings to her, and you'll call her in and try to get her to respond. And in this one particular case, she became extremely responsive, and more people began making offerings to her, and she was given a sacrificial cult name, because again, you need to name them, the name you'll give them when they're entering the temple. And in this case, she got the name, and some of you might have heard this name for reasons I'll get to momentarily, Madzu became her name. This was her temple name. And it quickly reached the point where anyone who was going out on the ocean from the southeast coast, you wouldn't go on the ocean without making an offering to her. And she was so supportive and so responsive that she became this very beneficent goddess, supporting people as they went out onto the ocean. And more people, therefore, began joining this cult. An entire temple network begins forming around the cult of Madzu, such that if you are in any manner, shape, or form involved in merchant activity, you will join this temple network. You will make offerings to Madzu. Indeed, within a few centuries, this becomes so significant that then as the huge Chinese diaspora begins spreading throughout Southeast Asia, it's largely through the cult of Madzu. And the way this will physically work is you will make offerings to Madzu, you will then support the temple network. When people, say, want to move to Indonesia, merchants want to move to Indonesia, the temple network will actually support a group moving to Indonesia. They'll form a new temple to Madzu in Indonesia, and will pay money back into the temple network as they become successful. And with that money, the network will then grow further. So as you're getting a sense with just these two examples, what begins to happen in China are a huge number of lineage ancestral cults, not surprisingly. Also an extraordinary number of these temple networks that begin spreading based upon the worship and form new relationships, is even a better way to put it, of these gods and goddesses. And much of the landscape of China, therefore, came to work through this. And also, as an example I just mentioned, many things like local communities, local economies. And again, as we've even seen, even things like an entire diasporic movement will be funneled through these temple networks. So to say that religion wasn't important in China, not only is it an incorrect statement, you could really even flip it on its head and say much of the workings of Chinese society were based upon all these various forms of ritual activity in which you're altering your relationships with the living, you're altering relationships with the deceased and with other powers out there, and it came to really dominate the landscape. Not surprisingly, of course, as this is going on, I mean this meaning over this millennium, as well, the state becomes actively involved in trying to do the same thing at a larger level, trying to organize all of these different cults, trying to often take control of these different cults so that it will be the main one. It will give positions in a celestial bureaucracy to various of these gods and goddesses that become part of substantial temple networks. In short, think of the religious landscape of much of the pre-modern period as based in these endless attempts to ritually create better relationships, again, with the living, with the deceased, and with these other powers, to the extent that much of the actual fabric of everyday life came to work this way. Now, with that as a very quick introduction, let us turn immediately to a whole nother side of this. A side of this that is, if anything, even less well known than what I've been mentioning so far, which is the emergence of Taoism, which is a revealed religion operating on, in some ways, extremely different principles. And to introduce us to this, I am very honored to introduce as well one of the world's leading specialists on Taoism, Terry Kleeman. So, Terry, let me turn things over to you.
Thank you very much. So I cannot not start with a short plug for Michael's book downstairs, The Path, which is very oriented toward a popular audience. Michael has written an awful lot of things. Most of them are very esoteric and require knowledge of multiple languages. This is an accessible book that will introduce you to early China in a way that I think might change your life. So
You are much too polite.
take a look at that. So what Michael's been telling you about so far in China, we have a little bit of a problem, terminological problem dealing with it. It is, I think, a religion, but it is a diffuse religion. It's a religion without a center. It's a religion without a chief god, if you will. It's a religion that worships a variety of gods all in the same way. And it's that methodology, sort of, that general worldview, that outlook, that makes that constitute one realm of religious behavior, okay? It includes even the behavior, as Michael has pointed out, of the state. And you might think that that gives it a sort of shape, but the state really only controls the portions of that ritual realm that are relevant to itself. There are parts of it that it sets off and it says, this is just for us. But again, there are lots of other gods that are open to everyone, and the methods that are used by the state are essentially the same as the methods used by everyday people. Okay. So what I'm going to tell you about is something a little bit different. This is also a religion, but it's an organized, institutionalized religion that began in the 2nd century with a revelation from the Supreme Lord Lao, who is a godlike form of the figure Lao Tzu, the philosopher, but turned into a god. It was a revelation to a specific person, a man named Zhang Daoling, and it supposedly set up a covenant between heaven and mankind and human beings. And this covenant was specifically the rejection of everything that Michael has told you about. Okay. The idea to the Taoists that you would take a demon and give them offerings and try to turn them into a good spirit was just outrageous. Why are you trafficking with these demons? And the whole point of that was that the revelation revealed to the Chinese people for the first time the real Taoist gods. The true Taoist deities are transcended. They're far above all of these humans turned into quasi-deities that you see in the popular faith. They are real gods and goddesses. They do not depend on human beings for anything. One of the main points of the Taoist revelation was the rejection of blood sacrifice. Why do you make sacrifice to gods? Because they need it, because they want it, and because you can thereby indebt them. You can get power over a god by giving them food. The Taoists said, those are not gods. Those are just demons. There are real gods. They don't want your food. All they care about is your moral behavior. And what you see in early Taoism is a detailed set of precepts, rules, like the Ten Commandments, that everyone in the religion is supposed to follow. It is because the majority of people don't follow these that the world is in such a horrible state. This is just at the time when the Han Dynasty is coming apart. There's great natural disasters, there's epidemics, there's all sorts of problems occurring. Why? It's because people keep feeding these demons and giving them sustenance and letting them grow powerful. And then they come and they trouble us human beings. You need to reject all of that. You need to follow the Taoist path. And if you do, you actually attain what is another major theme of Michael's research. You actually, in some sense, become a god. You become not really a god, but a part of heaven, a celestial bureaucrat, an officer of heaven, with rights and responsibilities pursuant to that. You know, you have the power to command local deities, these reformed humans who like to come and steal people's food if they don't give them stuff, You just cut them down. Every Taoist is given power over his own set of spirit soldiers. And he's expected, he or she, there were Taoist masters who were female right from the beginning as well, is expected to use those spirit soldiers, to send them out and to gather up all of these loose, bloodthirsty quasi-gods and make sure that they follow the path of heaven, that they obey. Because what happens with them? They do try to reform. They try to be better. And so they're sent out maybe, they're sent out to collect some people whose time has come. But their nature is just bloodthirsty, So once they start killing people, it's hard for them to stop. And that's where the Taoists come in. The Taoists have their spirit soldiers, but more than that, they're sort of like cosmic lawyers. They're the guys who can send up a petition to heaven and say, hey, this spirit over here who you usually send out to collect heads, he's been breaking the rules. He's been taking people who don't deserve it. And the Taoist has the authority and the power to send that up to heaven. The bureaucrats in heaven will read it, and they'll change fate. And that's the Taoist secret to life. Yeah. It works out pretty well. So cosmic bureaucrats, cosmic lawyers. I often think of Taoists as Confucians of the other world. Michael's people worry about this world and laws and stuff like that. The Taoists deal with the cosmic laws. I should say that that's not quite the way Taoism is today. Taoism eventually came to an accommodation with these roughneck, sort of uncivilized spirits. So that since at least the Song Dynasty on, about 1200 on, Taoists have been sort of caretakers. And anytime one of these local gods needs to be reinstalled, or they're losing power, they don't seem to be very effective, they call the Taoists in. The Taoists put up a whole new sacred space dedicated to the Taoist gods. They call the Taoist gods down, and they reinstall that local god. They give him back his position, give him back his power, and so he's able to continue working. But they make sure that he follows all the rules, that he only takes the people he's supposed to. He doesn't take any people who are good, who aren't supposed to die yet, stuff like that. So that's the way it works today. In this very diffuse religious world that Chinese people belong to, they are able to choose who they want to go to their problems, to deal with their problems. They might go to a spirit medium who'll just deal with one of Michael's lower level gods. But if that doesn't work, they might need to find a Taoist. And the Taoist will solve their problems. And if the Taoist can't do it, we don't want to talk about the Buddhists today. But there are other opportunities as well. So. Come.
So, yes, sadly, I have to admit that Terry is right here. My gods and goddesses sometimes did return to their ghostly and demonic state. And in fact, even the term I was using, ghost, it equally can be translated as demon. And yes, I will admit, as Terry said, that sometimes happens because the sense is we're complex creatures, right? We have these complex energies. It's true for us, but it's true for them. So, for example, once you've formed one of these successful temple networks based upon the worship of a god or goddess, sometimes their demonic sides would come back again. And often what you would do is you would literally walk in the temple and scream at them, saying, look, we are doing our part in this relationship. You are not doing yours. You're returning to be a demon. Get back to being a supportive god and goddess. And it is true. If that would fail, one of your best options was to turn to the Taoists. And the sense was the Taoists have access to, as Terry said, these higher powers above this world of these demonic powers being made into ghosts being made into very telling Freudian gods and goddesses and occasionally slipping back. And the Taoists would hopefully be able to appeal to these higher powers who could come in and restore the celestial bureaucracy. So you're getting a sense of the fabric of this. On the one hand, local society really being run through these temple networks based upon the worship of these demonic figures being made into gods and goddesses, lineages being run through these ancestral organizations, and then Taoists building this much larger bureaucracy trying to have access to, again, higher spiritual beings. In other words, returning to the language here, very refined energies, refined chi above, who could actually come down and hopefully restore the demonic sides that sadly exist within we humans and with our relationship to these demonic powers. So this was much of the workings of China. What then happened? Oh, please jump in. Please.
I think it's useful also to point out the role of the Chinese state in all of this, because the Chinese state is in fact itself a religious actor.
Yes.
In a sense, the state, as I mentioned, has control of the state cult and apportions worship to these figures. But local magistrates also believed that they had authority over the local pantheon of gods. And so, for example, if there was a prolonged drought, a local official might take the statue of the local god out from the temple, put it under the sun, and beat it as a way of showing that the emperor and the state demands that these gods do their duty, take care of the people, provide them with their basic sustenance.
Indeed. So you're getting a sense now of how things worked. Now, let's move into more recent times and go back to, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, the claim that all of this is destroyed. In an almost literal sense, that's true, but not in the way we often put it. So let's quickly take a look at what does happen in the 20th century, and then what is happening right now when what we have been discussing is coming back at levels that would have been unimaginable to scholars, say, 20 years ago. So, what happens in the 20th century? So, the first part of this, of course, is well known. Over the course of the 19th century, China becomes, as much of the world does, an object of imperial expansion. It isn't literally colonized, as some areas are, but it becomes dominated and largely taken over by significant portions of Western powers. And part and parcel of what begins to go on is a claim that everything we have been discussing is some aspect of, I'll use the terms used at the time by the Western powers, traditional superstitious worship. Certainly the stuff I'm talking about, not the Taoists, but the stuff I'm talking about, indeed involves bloody sacrifices to demonic powers, as the Taoists would impolitely put it. But again, that's largely true. And so the argument is that all of this should be eradicated so that China can modernize. And then modernizers, reformers, in China begin actively doing so. And so beginning actually even in the late 19th century, but much more actively moving into the 20th century, a lot of the temples we've been discussing are physically destroyed. In fact, many would be literally made into schools. This is part of a whole reform program. We'll destroy the temples, in other words, destroy the superstitious world and make them into schools where people can be educated, as if people were not educated earlier in China. In fact, China had extraordinary emphasis on education. But the vision was, of course, by the imperialists that that wasn't the case. And so then you get successive waves of attempts to reform or modernize China. The most extreme of these, of course, occurs with a figure called Mao Zedong. And let me just give you an example of the way he put what he claimed to be doing, because it's very telling in terms of these larger themes we're looking at. So to explain one of the references Mao Zedong made, let me now, we're jumping chronology a lot here, so many apologies, but I'm now going to jump back again to millennia and jump to 221 BCE, when a figure unifies China for the first time and declares himself the first emperor of China. That term that we're translating emperor, of course, that's taking the Latin term emperor, it's a term we use to translate that title for the remainder of Chinese history. A better way to think of it, certainly for the first emperor himself, would be the first august deity. He, the first emperor, I'll use that mistranslation therefore, since it's come into common parlance, the first emperor really wanted to claim he was going to institute a radically new era in China, radically different from anything that existed in the past. He indeed used terms we can even translate pretty accurately as saying, I'm going to wipe out the tradition of the past, and I will make it into the contemporary, I will modernize, and I will therefore wipe out all of these old temples, and I will create a new era with himself, obviously, as the great deity. He, the first emperor, in part fails, so his grand new imperial dynasty that's supposed to last for 10,000 generations falls less than 20 years later. So not terribly successful. And then a new dynasty is formed called the Han Dynasty that does keep his title, but actually brings back all that we have been discussing. Then Mao Zedong emerges. And Mao Zedong states, among many things, but among the things he states, to give you a sense of the cultural resonance of these terms, he states, I am going to be like the first emperor, but unlike the first emperor, I'm going to succeed. I will completely wipe out all of these traditional things once and for all and truly create a completely new world. So, again, The temples, to an even greater degree than before, were wiped out. Scriptures were burned. Among the things the first emperor reputedly did was to burn the books, so the Mao in the Cultural Revolution calls upon the same. And the idea was we will simply, once and for all, wipe all of this out. So, yes, destroying is, if anything, a too mild a word for what was going on during the Cultural Revolution. Wipe out everything we have been discussing and create a completely new world, with Mao, as needless to say, a somewhat divine figure. Then, of course, things began to change. Mao himself, of course, passed away. New leaders came to take over the Communist Party. The Communist Party began to focus very strongly on building a powerful economy. As they began to do so, they began to let local societies, or local economies as they would call it, begin to grow again. And lo and behold, as these local economies began to grow, the temples start being rebuilt, because of course that's how a lot of these economies go. And the government hasn't said it's okay. I mean, not literally. It has a few accepted religions, and what we've been talking about isn't among them. But de facto, the current view of the state is we will sort of allow it to go because it seems to be very productive for the economy, to put it mildly. And so all of a sudden, the temples are being rebuilt. In fact, that's, if anything, putting it too mildly, they're being rebuilt oftentimes in more extravagant ways than they were before. The temple networks are being recreated, but now often going the other way. So to return to my earlier example, if you go to the southeast coast, those old temples were all destroyed in successive waves of the 20th century. With the Chinese diaspora that spread from this area, who later became very, very wealthy, that money is now being brought back through the networks and paying for the rebuilding of the temples, again, in extravagant, stunning levels. I mean, they are just incredibly powerful. And slowly but surely, all of this is beginning to return. When we, therefore, look at China, going back to the narrative with which I began, saying, first of all, China had no religion. As we've seen, that's a poverty of our term of religion. It certainly did, but we need to expand our understanding of what religion is. And when we say in the 20th century, China modernized and rejected whatever did exist, again, only at a certain point. I mean, yes, in the 20th century, all of this was actively rejected, but it wasn't because it was modernizing, or rather that was the self-proclaimed vision of what it would mean to modernize. But now, all of a sudden, it's all coming back. Where will this take us? Who knows? Who knows? But what I would say, just as one of the many lessons to learn from this very quick introduction, is accept as a fact that most of our categories for understanding things like religion, ritual, ethics, the state, all of these things need to be revised when you're looking at what's going on in China. That's obviously true for understanding the past, something we think is very important. But for those of you who are not historians, let me also add, it's not just the past, because it's coming back. And to understand what is going on now, how these temples are being rebuilt, how again local economies are being worked through temple networks, how you're getting these networks spreading across national boundaries, we're beginning to see another part of an old past re-emerging in Asia that you don't see ever mentioned in newspapers and in discussions of the growing economies of Asia, and yet is a crucial part of not only the economic life, but the social fabric of Asia, and will be undoubtedly, however this plays out, an incredibly important aspect of however things will play out in the several decades to come. Would you like to make a few comments on any of this?
Yeah, it's an interesting age we're entered into now. There is indeed a revival. There has been a revival in China, I would say, since the 1980s. There is actually right now a sort of suppression going on. And it isn't looking quite so optimistic as it was perhaps a while ago. I think when the 20th century reformers set out to eliminate superstition from their lives. They didn't really understand the key role that religion played in traditional Chinese civil society. This really is the only sort of cultural form in most towns other than the government. You know, the main temples in town all have temple committees that are composed of the primary figures in town, you know, rich people, but also the educated and politically important and things like that. And for example, in Ken Dean's work on this very important port in China called Putian that has a very extensive irrigation network, he found that the water was being allocated among all of these small communities by the temples. It was the temples that controlled the irrigation network. And although there is this encouraging revival of interest in religion in China, I still find China being a bit a place without a path, without a clear ethical norm, without a standard of ethics, of correct behavior. I think at one point socialism was supposed to supply that, but it doesn't seem to have done it very effectively. And if you look at Chinese communities outside of the People's Republic of China, you really see the way in which these traditional religious beliefs still are very tied to societal norms and just to the ideas of like compassion for the downtrodden and the poor and people excluded from power. And that's a little bit missing in modern China today, I think. So I'm hoping that there will be further revival that actually brings back some of that original esprit, that original sense of being, of meaning for these religions.
And yeah, let me just underline that point by saying, yes, I mean, remember, a lot of these are our conceptions in the West that were taken over for much of the 20th century. And in those conceptions, to modernize means getting rid of things like rituals and temples and all of that. And as Terry mentioned, that is where many of the moral norms were worked through local society. That is how much of the fabric of life was worked through. Its active destruction over the course of the 20th century had horrific implications. And indeed, I think one of the key issues facing China now is, will this revival be allowed to continue? Will all of the work that comes out of ritual, including moral bearings, etc., be allowed to continue? Or will the government return to its suppression, which, as Terry mentioned, there are signs that is beginning yet again. And if that continues, the implications could be extremely dangerous. So, to quickly sum up, part of what I think we can learn from China is we need to realize that a lot of our assumptions, certainly about things like tradition, modernity, ritual, all of these terms that we perhaps think we understand, dealing with China, both its past and its present, forces us to rethink those concepts, or putting it differently, note the dangers in the 20th century when those concepts were taken over and really employed with such horrific force in China. And if we allow those assumptions to be challenged, we will, by definition, understand China better, and yes, we may have a better understanding of a lot of our own assumptions about the self, about ritual, about religion in general, about what we like to call the modern world. So, with that as a very brief introduction, should we turn things over to you all? Questions, comments, thoughts? And the answer is
Stick your hands up.
A ton of questions, not surprisingly, so please.
So along with China contemporarily is a greening movement where there is a huge focus on ecology, and the Wild Conference is set to be there. So I'm wondering, in the old religions, deities, especially of the local kind, are associated with place, mountain, stream. I'm wondering if you see the connection currently. Would you speak to it?
Yes.
Yeah, well, Taoism especially is promoting itself as a green religion now. I've written an article where I sort of challenge that a little bit. But I would say that there is a traditional Chinese attitude toward the world, that human beings are supposed to live in harmony with the world, that certain actions are appropriate to certain times and inappropriate to other times, that I do think has something to say to the general ecological movement. And it's pan-Chinese probably more than just Taoist.
Yes.
Have a lady here.
Yes, and yes, I agree. So yes.
Can you comment on the role of Confucianism, the values? Because from what I understand, the little I understand, there's been a revival. I think that was suppressed. I don't know whether it was during Mao Zedong's time, but I think it's been brought back so much so that you have this Confucius Institute,
Yes.
overseas as like a cultural ambassador. And for me, that Confucianism is like the foundation, the bedrock of Chinese values, societal norms, relationships.
Yes.
Can you
Yes.
comment on that? Yeah, the
Thank you.
evolution of.
Yes, absolutely. Wonderful question. And yes, indeed. So a lot of these rituals, these norms that we've been talking about, these attempts to use rituals to improve our relationships with each other, this was oftentimes associated with many figures, but certainly one of them was Confucius, absolutely. And certainly in the 20th century, when they're being rejected, they are, again, literally associated with Confucius. To give the extreme example, when I was mentioning Mao and the Cultural Revolution trying to wipe out the past, among the things that would happen would be particular figures who Mao really hated would be labeled Confucian, by which he meant trying to call for a return to tradition. I mentioned these tomb texts. Many of them weren't published because there's one huge tomb opened up in 1973, some of the texts of which were published immediately because they were non-Confucian. Others were deemed Confucian, and we didn't get to read them until the 1990s. So Confucius becomes associated with everything that needs to be rejected under Mao. Then, indeed, as we mentioned, you're seeing this revival. A lot of the old temples, a lot of the old rituals are being revived, and you're seeing an old theme reemerging of the state trying to jump on top of this and gain control of this. So on the one hand, all of these local societies used to operate through these rituals. That's beginning to occur again. Because of that, of course, you have a state that wants to be in control of it. And the most recent iteration of this is the government is indeed saying, and I'm finally getting back to the heart of your question, the government is indeed saying, let's revive Confucianism. So if Mao said, let's destroy Confucianism and associated Confucianism with all of the old rituals, now the government is saying, let's return to it. But of course, what the government is trying to return to is a specific definition of that. And it's referring really not to the revival that we've been talking about. It's really saying, let's make Confucianism into, and the word is a very accurate translation, into an ism, right? Let's make it into a totalizing ideology that is all about supporting elders, supporting the state, loyalty to the state, and let's make this into a unifying new ism. So I think part of what you're seeing going on is a state trying to actively gain control of this revival. I might add, if Mao compared himself to the first emperor, you might remember I mentioned very briefly, after the first emperor's dynasty falls, there's another empire called the Han Dynasty that keeps the imperial title but allows a lot of the old networks to reemerge. The figure there is named Emperor Wu. He's the key figure that really consolidates imperial power, and he's the one that also maintains the support of the ideas associated with the figure called Confucius. So it is very clear Xi Jinping is very much presenting himself as a modern Emperor Wu who is going to revive Confucianism as against Mao in the exact same way as Emperor Wu did against the first emperor. But again, it's a particular vision of what Confucianism is. So part of what will be fascinating and very important from a world historical level to follow over the decades to come is what Confucius emerges out of these different tendencies. Are we talking about the local sort of revival of ritual, which both Terry and I are saying would be, at least we think, a very important and powerful thing, or is it going to be a new state ideology of a Confucianism made into a totalizing ideology of support the state? And both are actively going on, and among the many things to watch in the future of China will be, in a sense, which wins or which will ultimately take power in terms of how this revival will play out. So thank you, wonderful question. Thank you.
So my question is, do you think that Falun Dafa, I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, do you think that is something that the Chinese government would consider re-entering for unity instead of having all these sects? Do you understand the question?
Which was the
So,
Falun Dafa.
Oh, yes.
yeah, okay.
Do you want to take it or?
Oh, sure. So the main threat of Falun Dafa to the Chinese state is precisely in its organization. China does not want to have any organizations in China that are not controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. Every single organization in China has a Chinese Communist Party member assigned to it who is really in charge of it, and Falun Dafa does not.
Could you let everybody know what it is and how many people in China were doing it before it was?
Yeah, I don't know how well you... The Falun Gong people claim that there were 60 million believers in China at one point. I don't know that there's any proof for that. But it was a mass movement. There clearly were millions of believers. It was at one point, I'm sure, the fastest growing religion in the world. And it was, and still is, horribly suppressed with violence.
Can you please, can you please stand up if you have a question? Thank you.
When I visited China several years ago, I went to the White Horse Temple, and that had been very badly damaged. How does that fit into the revival now? Or what was the background?
So during the Cultural Revolution, hordes of young people just went around destroying every type of religious artifact they could find. This was nothing new. I mean, the same thing had happened in the Taiping Revolution in the middle of the 19th century, and that was inspired by a quasi-Christianity. But religious intolerance is nothing new to China, let's say. Yeah.
Hello, over here.
Stand, please.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, great, thank you.
Okay, Michael, Terry. I recently discovered what I've been noticing for several years is that there's a movement, of course, away from the falling away of the American empire to a tripartite hegemony for the rest of the foreseeable future in the world, and that would include Russia and China, of course. But I've recently been informed that at the time of Yeltsin in 1997 was the first meeting between a Russian leader and the Chinese head of the party. And there have been several such meetings since then in which this is exactly what they're attempting to implement. They've now recruited our own president to this particular point of view, and this autocratic wave that's happening across the world. I look now at our Christian fundamentalist culture. I look at Russia and its secular autocracy using the Russian Orthodox Church. I look at China, where Xi has just gotten himself democratically, quote unquote, within the party, elected emperor for life. And I don't see any deep spiritual unifying culture available from any of these three countries to actually bring people together around the world in some inspired way to meet not only the challenge of nuclear war, but of course, climate change. So do you see any possibility of that coming from China? In the near term, I do not. And I think they'll only work with the climate change to the exact extent it's necessary, as the engineers for Deng Xiaoping said, we've got to do something. We've got to start this 386 movement to, go into new energy in March of 1986. Otherwise, we're going to choke to death. So that's their motivation. I just am really curious if you see these seeds of local traditionalism bearing fruit within any lifetime of ours lifespan.
Sure. Yeah, wonderful question. And I think you're very accurate about what is going on at the high state level. I think there's a very active and very self-conscious attempt on the part of the leadership in China, Russia, and indeed currently the United States to overthrow the neoliberal order that had been dominant since the 1980s and certainly consolidated to the 1990s, and really recreate the world along very, very different lines. And in terms of your point, is there your term I think was very well put, a deep unifying force out of the revival we're talking about? I think you're right. The answer would be no, although let me take it nonetheless to a hopefully optimistic note, which is maybe the lack of a unifying force might be part of what would be exciting. In other words, if in this revival what you're seeing is a revival of these old network systems, which as Terry mentioned was in constant tension with the empires for 2 millennia, and the empire was constantly trying to take control of them, at times very successfully, but at times not. And maybe, just maybe, what you're going to see there is a level of organization that would maintain power that the state couldn't be able to completely control. Now, again, obviously the states can do everything it can to control it, but maybe it will fail. So please, a follow-up, please.
I want to say, the quick follow-up that I've seen myself is that the wild card in all of this, honoring our JLF creators here, is India. India is often left out of this equation, but Peter Drucker, the great international business guru, was asked before his death, which of the two great populated countries, India and China, do you see as dominating and bringing through value in the 21st century? And without hesitation, he said India. And they said, well, why do you say that? There's this economic miracle, all these skyscrapers in China and so on. He answered with one word: democracy. So he's putting his bet on the human spirit that ultimately all of the things that are happening in any of these three countries plus India may be that India might emerge actually with the Bhagavad Gita as a spiritual unifying text, whatever, but let's not leave India out of this equation.
Indeed, and let me just underline the point in our closing comments by noting when what we now look back at as the beginning of the modern world, when the Western powers began this imperial takeover, it's important to remember what they were imperially taking over were all of these massive trade networks that were spreading throughout all of Eurasia, all of Africa, and the imperial powers, it's very clear, they were literally saying so in so many words, the goal is to not only gain access to the trade networks, but ultimately to create military juggernauts that could take them over, colonize the key nodes, and recreate the world economy under a colonization form that would obviously greatly enhance the power of the West. And as we know, that largely happened because the imperial powers, of course, in that attempt to do so, hit the Americas. They created a new economy based upon slavery and ultimately accomplished that. Now, the reason I mentioned that quick historical note in answer to the excellent point here is keep in mind, too, just to underline what you're saying, this isn't just a China phenomenon. These old networks are re-emerging all over the place, absolutely in India. And again, these were global networks. These were not simply within what we think of as a nation state, since the nation states didn't exist back then. These were global networks. And part of the hope may be, we often look at what's going on at the state level, which, needless to say, is incredibly important, but also at these local levels, you get a tremendous movement of ideas, goods, gods and goddesses, all of what we've been talking about. And that's a whole side we often don't focus on. And indeed, it's not only in China, it is absolutely true in India. It is potentially global. And so let us now, for lack of time, but also on this wonderful question, wrap things up by just simply noting part of the power that we gain through, I think, a literary festival like this, and more particularly through hopefully a discussion of China within it, is an attempt to, again, challenge our assumptions and see possibilities and potentialities in the world that may exist if we can move past our own categories and our own assumptions about how things work. So, in conclusion, let me give my deep thanks to Terry Kleeman for joining us. Please order his book, Celestial Masters. It is an amazing study of Taoism. Sadly, not downstairs, but I click it. So thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you to Michael and Terry.